Welcome in. I'm Collette Wieland alongside Dr. Stephen Camarata. If you're new here, Steve is a professor, a best-selling author. He is internationally recognized for his work, especially when it comes to late talking children. And if you're new here, then you don't know. We've been asking for questions, but if you've been with us for a while, we've been collecting those questions, your comments, and Steve's going to help answer those today. So I'm going to go through some of them. We have a question from Lisa. Lisa wants to know if there is evidence that daycare improves social skills in late talkers.
So a lot of times there'll be a late talker that's home and it's a good home environment, maybe some siblings there too. And someone might say, oh, you need to get them into preschool or daycare in order to help them learn social skills. That's not really good advice. So preschools and daycares are good for helping a child learn how to be in school and the social ideas around that, but they don't help a child be more social because they're not really providing that back and forth types of interactions that mothers do so well with their children. So if you want your child to be in daycare, fine, it won't hurt them. On the other hand, if you can be home with your child, don't feel like you've got to not do that in order to be in daycare. It's certainly not true that being in daycare improves social skills.
I appreciate you saying that because I remember first-time mom, it's like the question is, when are you going to send your kid to daycare? You know, don't you want them to be socialized? But that's a great point you made.
Yeah, socialized means socialized to school, routine of following other children, and that's important for being in school. But as far as social interaction, person-to-person, conversation, and so on, daycare doesn't really teach that.
And you've said it before that really the parents, the primary teachers at home, right? So they can work with their late talker.
They can. And in fact, we know that the most important thing that supports not only social skills, but also vocabulary and other language skills is turn taking. And children are going to get a lot more turn taking at home than they are in school. If you think about a school environment, children are primarily conditioned to sit in a circle or follow the routine, and there's not that much where they initiate and then someone responds. That happens a lot more frequently at home. So there's some real advantages to being at home. I worry when I say that, though, that parents who put their children in daycare will feel guilty, and it's fine. It won't hurt them to put them in daycare. But what I do worry about is when there's a great home environment and somebody who's well-meaning but misguided says, oh, you need to put them in daycare, and then they take them away from that rich home environment. So don't take your child away from a good home environment. That's what you can do. If your child's in daycare, it's fine. Please don't have any guilt over it.
We have another question from a parent who wrote, and they want to know about doing too little versus too much. So this particular parent has heard many parents of late talkers say that they wish they had just let their child progress at their own pace. But on the other hand, they've heard a lot about the importance of early intervention, especially if this late talker also has autism.
So it is so important to think about a child's developmental level and meeting them where they are. And we just talked a little bit about how a home environment is really good. And so harnessing that is really important. And that's really, if you think about early intervention, the centerpiece of early intervention is working with the parents in order to help them even further enhance their child's development. So that's what it should look like. A lot of times parents will get an autism diagnosis. They'll say, oh, we got to put your child in 40 hours a week of treatment. That's not really evidence-based. The reality is we don't have good dose studies. In autism, we know that whether you do 15 hours or 20 hours or 40 hours doesn't make a difference. We don't know what the lower end of that is. In other words, is 10 hours as good as 15 hours? There's been a couple of big national studies to show that you don't really need 40 hours a week. The other thing to think about is it's really important for a child to experience normal child things, playing, going to the playground, having recreational activities. These things are really important. And so if you're putting your child in, therapy 24/7, you're displacing that. There's an opportunity cost. And so you really want to balance being a child and being able to grow up with, the kind of supports that you need. And so the key here is meeting your late talker where they are, living in the moment, enjoying the moment, and also making sure that they have time to be a child. It's very important.
Yeah, kind of follow up my own question to this question from a parent. If you're doing too much, how do you expect a child to respond that that this is just too much for them? What's a typical response like if it's just too much for a child that you have personally seen?
That's a really important question. So you want to be in tune with your child. And so when you're really stressing them out and you're putting too much onto them, they'll get upset, they'll get frustrated, they'll be crying a lot. And that's a signal to you that maybe you need to kind of think about it. And as a parent, we have this system where you're trying to move the children along by their age level. And that can really overwhelm a late talking child. And for example, a parallel I like to use is, let's say that your late talker is not walking when they're 1. Would you do a very intensive 40-hour-a-week program to get them to walk? No. The normal, natural kind of development of walking is anywhere between 9 and 18 months. Now, if they have an orthopedic problem or something like that, cerebral palsy, well, then we're going to do some supports and so on, maybe physical therapy. But there's a variety of normal development for motor development. It's the same thing with social and talking. And we have kind of this benchmark that parents are trying to hit year to year. We go online and there's these like, your child should be doing X, Y, and Z at this age. There's a lot of variability around that. And please don't try to force your child to do things when they're not ready.
Oh my gosh, it's the most frustrating thing that all this information is out there on the internet, because you can just go down a Google spiral.
You can, yeah.
And so I imagine a lot of parents, am I not doing enough? Am I doing too much?
Right.
So in regards to like not the other hand of that question, not doing enough, right? What if a parent just chooses, you know what, I'm just going to ride this out? Is there harm in that?
So there's not any general harm. And actually, again, we don't have really good studies to say, not doing anything versus doing too much and where the sweet spot is. I wish I could give you a data-based answer. I will say that when you have a late talker, there are certain natural things that happen in the environment that we can harness and enhance. So it's good if you have a speech path, a special educator, an occupational therapist, somebody who's going to be a coach and a partner with you so they can see the child developmentally with expertise and say, okay, here's the next thing. So like in talking, the first thing is getting your child to be intelligible so you can understand what they say. So there's certain types of interactions that'll facilitate speech development. Once you can understand them well enough, then you want to work on words. Okay, you might say, well, I want to work on long sentences. I want to work on War and Peace. And it's like, you can do that when they're a teenager, but for right now, we just want to learn words. And so everything in its time, and that's important. But also, if you know somebody or you can get the information yourself, or if you have a partner, a communication coach, then they can tell you, okay, here's what I want you to work on for now. Once we get to that point, then we can move on to the next thing. One of my favorite stories is Mary would wake me up at night. These conversations have to happen at 2 a.m. For some reason. I've learned that. And she would say, "Oh, what's your late talk? What's our late talker going to be when he's in school and high school and so on?" And I was like, "I'm trying to teach him 10 new words this week. We'll find out when we get there." So, he's married now, and which is neither here nor there as far as a late talker go. But she would ask me, "Think he'll ever be married?" I don't know, but yeah, he ended up getting married. Anyway, the key is to say, okay, here's what my child needs to learn today in the next few months. The rest of it will evolve in ways that are hard to imagine, but you really want to be focused in the moment as much as you can be. And I know it can be a tidal wave of worry. And to the extent you can kind of lock that in a box as best you can, it's better for you and for your late talker.
So the takeaway is sometimes there's too much and sometimes there's too
little.
little.
And if you learn to read your child, they'll let you know when you're pushing them too hard. They'll, like reading. I know, again, with my late talker, they would give this extensive summer reading list, and I would work at the school and saying, this is going to make him not like reading. So let's just maybe pick one or two of these, we'll work on that together, and then we'll expect that. And then, ironically, he became a political science major, and actually is one of my best readers of all my children. But if we had tried to pound that before he was ready, I just can't imagine he would enjoy reading. Yeah. So everything in its moment, everything in its time, that's the way to do it.
Right. Our listener, Paige, has some questions about apraxia, dysarthria.
Yes, right. All these technical words we create to sound really serious. Yes.
Yes. And AAC, which you said stands for Augmentative Alternative Communication. So real quick, again, for people who may not understand this question, apraxia and...
So when a child is... So some late talkers have difficulty pronouncing their words, and they're really hard to understand. And so we call that a speech disorder. A subtype of speech disorder comes from motor problems. So, for example, a child who has cerebral palsy is going to have difficulty speaking because they have general coordination problems, and so that's dysarthria. Bless you.
Thank you.
So dysarthria is a speech disorder that comes out of a general motor coordination problem. And there's things we can do to help that, and help that child to learn how to speak more intelligibly. Apraxia is really interesting because it's a motor speech disorder, but it's motor planning. And so what happens is that the child can make the sounds correctly sometimes, but not other times. The other piece of it is that they can do things involuntarily that they can't do voluntarily. So, for example, apraxia often happens in people who've had strokes. So you might walk into the room and the person who's had a stroke might be scratching their head like this, just sitting there. And you come in and you say, okay, I want you to put your hand on your head, and they'll go. They can't do it. And so they show you they can do the motor activity involuntarily, but when you ask them to do it on demand, they can, and that's apraxia. And so if a child has a severe speech disorder and they get to be a bit older and you can't understand them, we might use a computer, a tablet, we might use pictures, we might use cards, things like that in order to support helping them to be intelligible. And the reason that's really important is, number one, if they can communicate what they want and need more precisely, they're not going to be as frustrated. But then also I talked about all these learning opportunities. So if you know what it is they're trying to say, then you can respond modeling those words, which is going to help their speech and language development. The example I like to use is there's a study that was done with children with Down syndrome. People with Down syndrome have apraxia and dysarthria often, so they're really hard to understand. And so my colleague, John Miller, University of Wisconsin, and his colleague, Mark Letty, they taught children with Down syndrome how to use sign language when they were little. And people say, oh, they're going to sign, they won't learn to talk, and so on. But it turned out that if you went back 3 years later, the ones they taught sign language to had a lot more words, oral words, and a lot better speech. And the reason is that when they did the sign, the parents knew their intended message, and they could model the speech. So we think of AAC the same way. So for some children, very few, thankfully, their pronunciation problems or speech problems will be such that they have to use a computer or tablet to communicate the rest of their life. Not that common, thankfully. For others, we might use that as a bridge to spoken language. And so we use augmentative communication. Usually when a child gets to be about 3, somewhere in there, there's not a set age, but 3 or 4, and their speech is so unintelligible, we need to give them something that'll kind of talk for them or that they can use to make themselves understood. And that's augmentative communication. So that's important. The other thing I want to say about augmentative communication is sometimes people will just teach how to activate the device or use these kind of complicated symbols. You really want something that's very useful to the child. You don't want it to only be in school. You want to be able to use it at home and generalize it. And then the last thing I'll say, I was working with a family where mom and dad are both physicians, and they've adopted a son with some genetic genetic conditions that make their speech really, really hard. And so they got an augmentative system, and mom said to me, I don't know how to work this thing. And so I'm thinking to myself, look, here's a 5-year-old with genetic conditions and a speech disorder, and mom and dad who are physicians can't make the device work. Probably not a good match for them. So we want something that's simple, effective. Getting the AAC will not keep the child from learning how to talk. It actually can be a bridge to communication. And then for those who have severe speech disorder that's persistent, then that might be the main way they communicate on into the future.
To build on this question from Paige, so she wants to know, with the AAC devices being implemented for a student, are there precautions in a school setting with those? And can you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, the biggest precaution is that a huge majority of AAC devices, they spend a lot of money on them. They spend a lot of time teaching the child. They never use them. And so the precaution is that you want to make sure that you're thinking about how to harness the child's natural communication, how they're using it, and then also you want to make sure that device isn't just taught in the school, in the speech path room or whatever it is, that you're using it in classrooms, they're using it on the playground, and they're using it at home. It's never going to work unless there's a really a value to it for the child in terms of them getting what they need. It's really important we think about that communication piece. It's AAC, but really we should think about it as CAA, communication using augmentative. And so that's really how you want to focus. So again, the schools aren't necessarily bad. In fact, a lot of them are good. It's just that they're going to be really focused on teaching the child how to activate the device, but not necessarily how to use it. We actually published that back in 1993 still got a lot of work to do to have the society embrace that we need to really think about how to communicate with the device as opposed to just activating it.
So what's your advice for Paige and other parents that this may be an option for them to have a device for their child in the classroom? How should they approach that when talking to the schools?
Yeah, so they should approach it with, I really want something that my child can use that's very simple. A lot of devices are really complicated. As I said, the physicians couldn't figure out how to activate it and program in the screens and all that. And so you want to start off with something simple. I recommend using pictures. Sign language can also be something. I start off simple and see how they take to it, and then you can then build in a device into that if needed. But a lot of children, even just a simple set of cards or photographs, maybe even using a phone or an iPad in a simple way. There's actually some low-cost software you can use. Try that out before you take the plunge into a really complicated system.
Another parent, Steve, wants to know, are late talkers likely to be late to write as well?
Great question. So if you think about it as late to write in terms of language, like reading and writing in that domain, about 40% of late talkers are late readers and writers in terms of that part. But as far as penmanship goes, most late talkers have really bad penmanship. And so they are. And that's interesting, because it's not necessarily a fine motor problem. But I tend not to spend a lot of time trying to teach writing because it's very frustrating. Certainly I defer to my colleagues, occupational therapists who really know how to do this. But going forward, there's other higher priorities than writing. Plus, we can usually teach keyboarding pretty early. And as time goes on, if the late talker is pretty intelligible, speech to text kinds of things are getting better and better. So anyway, the answer is yes. There's a pretty good probability they're going to have trouble learning to read and write, about a little bit less than half, and then a really higher probability that in terms of handwriting, they're going to be really not good handwriters.
Is that something that can be improved on?
It can be if you're willing to spend the time and do it. For me, it's like, what's the trade-off? Are there other things that are more important? And so someone has really good penmanship that's good and worth it. I'll tell you that last semester I was writing on the board, and I'm a late talker. My handwriting is terrible. I was really happy when my penmanship grade dropped out of my GPA in fourth grade. And I was doing cursive, and the students said to me, "We can't read cursive." And so there's a generation that don't even learn how to read and write cursive, and it was like, even though my handwriting's not very good, I really had to use printing because they couldn't read cursive script. So I think take that for what it's worth. I wouldn't spend a lot of time on handwriting. You just want to make sure it's legible enough so you can read it. And then go to keyboarding as soon as you can. No, absolutely. I mean, that's the way the world is, right?
See, I think there's a beauty in the art.
Oh, I agree. No, calligraphy, and I love that. I think it's really cool. I'm not disparaging that. I'm talking about if your child penmanship is a problem and handwriting is a problem, we don't want to focus too much on that because there's other things that are high priority to learn. And there's absolutely a value and a virtue in handwriting. I would never discourage it, but I wouldn't pound it to the point where the child's getting frustrated.
Keep encouraging
Again,
them
it's this developmental framework we're talking about. Absolutely, yeah.
Liza wrote in with some concerns about what happens as your late talking child grows up. So what kind of resources are available to them, especially if they do not have autism or fall within that autism spectrum?
So this is a really important question. There's kind of this big burst and focus on toddlerhood and preschool. And people kind of know what to do in their services, and we've talked about some of the landmines that can happen. But generally speaking, there's a lot available. And then once a child hits third, fourth grade, middle school, and so on, the services really aren't as focused or as helpful. And so it's really important for parents to think about the longer term. So late talkers have personality traits such as being stubborn, also kind of learning in their own way. Many of them are better visually spatially than they are auditory. I don't want to think about it as a split brain or something like that. It's a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So that's going to be with them the rest of your life. They're going to have that difference in who they are. But in terms of getting support services, again, the developmental framework is your friend. So you think about, okay, early on, we know how to teach words, we know how to teach early sentences, we know how to teach word endings, but what about complex sentences? What about social interaction? What about conversation? So you basically look at your late talker and think about the things they need to learn and the things they need to have when they're an adult, and you're kind of arranging it that way, because it really is difficult once they get into late grade school and middle school to have services. The good news is that late talkers on average tend to be less influenced by peer pressure, which is a real benefit, because peer pressure in teenage years can be the road to perdition, if I can talk about that. So there is a little bit of a benefit. Late talkers tend to look at their friends who are doing things that they're not interested in, and they tend not to necessarily feel the social pressure to join in, which can be protective in a way. I know my own late talker would sometimes say, Dad, they're not responsible learners. And I just appreciated that about him. Whereas I have one child who was very social, and I did worry about that child joining in just to be part of the crowd. So, and she's great, but I mean, I did worry about that a little bit, and I didn't worry about that with my late talker.
One thing you and I have discussed in the past is getting those eligibility for services, right? So kind of going around this question from Liza, what does that look like at that third, fourth, and moving on? Do you have to get reevaluated in order to keep getting those services?
You do. Okay. So the way it works is you initially get made eligible birth to 3. At 3, you transition into preschool, and then in kindergarten, you get reevaluated for eligibility. Then that's in place for 3 years. So when you get to be in 3rd grade, you get another eligibility. And what happens often is a lot of your late talkers are no longer eligible for speech and language services. They're going to migrate them to learning disabled, if they have reading problems and things like that. But then they don't really necessarily think about the conversational skills, the complex syntax, and the things like that really are still a challenge and a weakness for the late talker. They tend to focus more on reading, and maybe if they have trouble in math. A lot of them are good in math, but if they have trouble in math, they'll focus on that. So they become more like tutoring and less on the late talking kind of thing. And then once they get into middle school and high school, they might transition into what's called life skills, depending on the challenges and eligibility. So it's a real challenge, and the part that I think is difficult is you get something in place that's working, and then a few years later they take it away and you have to go through the process again, and so that's really a challenge. It's a difficult system to navigate. So again, in that middle school and high school, there's a lot of advocacy, there's a lot of resources, but parents really have to know their rights and try to help the system work when it's not really as focused on late talking as we'd like. You mentioned autism spectrum, or who was it that was asking the question? Liza. So actually the question, Liza. So in autism, it's really, since the spectrum is so broad, in fact, it's getting to the point where all late talkers are being put on the spectrum. I completely disagree with that perspective, but it's what's happening. It's really important to say, these are my child's strengths and weaknesses. Here are the things, the routine preferring, maybe the anxiety that goes into it, and then the speech and language pieces of it that go into it, and the conversational pieces, and make the system support your child in the ways they need it, because a garden variety autism program is probably going to miss the boat in most of those areas. So you really have to be, any late talking child, you really have to be aware of your child's developmental patterns, their strengths and weaknesses, so you can then support their development and have the education system work for you instead of work against you.
We have a comment combo here, right, from one parent who really seems disappointed in the fact that you kind of have to push to get services for your child. So what could be done, for those parents who feel lost, and not sure which direction to go into?
So one of the real challenges is that a good speech path, a good special educator, a good occupational therapist, whoever's working with your child, they'll be really educated in terms of development. What should be learned when? They would know like pre-language, pre-speech kinds of things all the way up to complex things, conversation, and so on. And they're going to be able to meet your child where they are developmentally. That's actually a lot of information, and it's a lot of knowledge, and it's kind of hard for any individual to have it, okay? And so what happens is that a lot of times people will kind of hook on to a specific package. So they might say, oh, I'm doing, interactive metronome, which I don't recommend at all. Or I'm doing, facilitated communication, which we definitely don't want to do. But they'll learn a package, and then they'll put everybody into that package. And that's really not going to be good for your child. So you want to ask the person that's helping you, what's your approach? And is it a one-size-fits-all kind of thing? And so the best advice I can give to parents is to do the best you can to educate yourself about development and thinking about how to align all the education and service goals to building an adult brain and building an capable adult, and align all your services and education around that. And kind of, if somebody's marketing something, somebody's doing music tapes or things to rewire the brain, you really want to be pretty skeptical of that. And what you really need is to educate yourself so you can be a good consumer of the services. If somebody's like generating, for example, an apraxia diagnosis to do oral motor exercises or to push a certain kind of a treatment, maybe go away from that.
I have a question for you. When it comes to finding the right speech path or anyone that's going to be treating and working with your child, should you approach it like you approach a project at your house? Let's say you get 3 bids for paint, right? Because you want to paint your walls. Does that seem appropriate in this industry as well? Or
it
this
would.
medical
So if somebody's pushing something and your inner voice says, gee, I don't think this is right, or your child's really upset when they're going. I was working with the students on a case where a child was in a reading. He had a reading problem, and really a nice kid. And then he got all these reports back that he had behavior problems. And I'm like, well, what's going on with that? And it turns out that the tutor was trying to force him to do something he couldn't do. So he was very disruptive in her sessions because he was really unhappy with what they were teaching. So if something like that comes up, absolutely get different opinions. I've thought about this a lot, and I think the most important screener, regardless of the approach, is that the clinicians should say, here's what your child is good at, and here's how I'm going to build on it. You want those words to come out of the clinician's mouth. You want them, or the teacher too, you want to say, oh, your child is good at X, Y, and Z, and that's great. We're going to build on that. So you want to think about this idea of green flags. You want somebody who has a knowledge of development, education, and so on, and sees your late talker as somebody who can learn, and that their job is to help empower that. Not somebody who says, oh, your child can't do this, they can't do that. If we don't do this right away, they're going to fall further behind. All this kind of stuff, that shouldn't be part of the conversation. I mean, it's fine to say, here's where your child is, and we want to move them in this direction, and we've got some work to do together. That's fine, but the key is you want a can-do, positive person to be helping you with your late talker at any stage.
So parents should not be afraid to say, this doesn't feel right. I'm going to seek out another professional.
I would absolutely encourage them to have their questions answered, and if they're upset or their child's upset, to really try to understand that and get explanations. And if it's not a good match, walk away from it. That's absolutely do that for sure. Yeah.
Thanks, Steve, for answering all of those questions. We have more, but you're going to have to wait till next week, because that's when we'll sit back down and answer all of those. So in the meantime, please feel free, though, to add to this conversation, because I know we'll pick it back up again and continue to answer those questions. Leave them in the comments section below. Click subscribe so you don't miss a thing, and hit the bell. And you can always check out the Late Talkers Foundation website.
And remember, the best thing for your child is you.